Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Thursday, so it is Jordan Peterson Thursday. And as always, I'm delighted to have Roger and Claire lead this section. Today, the panelist is Dave. So over to you, Roger and Claire.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us this Thursday. So today we're going to be covering the chapter or the rule 11. Do not bother children when they are skateboarding. And in this chapter, Peterson will make a defense for masculinity and the masculine aspect of life. First, by an anecdote about children skateboarding and why boys especially are drawn to dangerous things. He'll then explore the psychological reasons why some may have desires to quell this drive. He'll focus on several causes, including resentment, ideological beliefs, and misguided beliefs about kindness. He'll also explore how men have been dropping out and suffering at an alarming rate from universities and a lot of other factors that have also contributed to that, and how this is not good news for both men or women. So the first section is aptly named Danger and Mastery. So what did you guys have anything on this section that you guys wanted to comment on?
Yeah, so he starts out here with kind of explaining why this chapter has this strange name. It's pretty specific about skateboarding, but there's a metaphor here around skateboarders that used to be around where Peterson went to school or something, and just his awe in the fear and the kind of dare-defying act that is skateboarding. And he, uses some other examples of planes that flip in the air a million times, and just the awe at which he would watch people do things that are dangerous. Now he felt like he could never do it. And he's going to start to set up here kind of this theme throughout the chapter, which is that if things are made too safe, that people will find a way to make them dangerous again, that it's just human nature. And when we are overprotected, when bad things happen, it's going to be a heck of a lot worse. When we fail, we're going to trip all the more harder. And so things like skateboarding, these daring acts really act to kind of put us close to chaos in a healthy way.
Yeah, and to me, the male proving themselves, to the females. I forget what the TV show was. What we had the high school kids jumping off the roof of the garage into a trash can, and wonderful stuff like that. And I was, kind of thinking down about that I remembered I was into auto racing in my 20s and had a hot rod and driving it too fast and got at least one speeding ticket I remember. And the other thing, it didn't really ties into it to me, but is graffiti that, we're expressing ourselves, but they express themselves all over the cedar fences of our subdivision. So yeah, it's one of those things, the rituals or rebellion that kids have to go through, I guess.
Yeah, I really liked, because essentially the case he's making here is that when kids engage in that dangerous behavior, what they're attempting to explore and master is bravery itself, right? Like it's not, and that's kind of what he points out, that like a lot of times they don't have any safety equipment, and that's part of the point, right? It's the fact that there's risk involved, that there's actually something to lose there. That's what makes it brave. Like there's nothing brave about going in with full equipment and falling and it doesn't even hurt. Like the risk is like, no, if you get this wrong, there's a big price to pay, but you still do it. And that idea of taking on voluntarily a massive risk. And I really like this quote that he had of humans, including kids, don't seek to minimize risk. They seek to optimize it. And what he means by that is that you're trying to get you're trying to get the highest risk that you can still manage, that you still feel comfortable handling. But I also really like this idea of the general idea that he had, that if we don't learn how to take risk on, we're just not going to be prepared when inevitable risk occurs, when we do have to take it on and it's not a choice anymore. And from there, he kind of starts to build, he talks about how, these kids that were skateboarding and eventually the administration put skate blockers on there. And it's what kind of got him to this whole thought process of like, well, why would someone do that? Why is someone attempting to prevent these kids from skateboarding, from acting out in a dangerous way, aside from just the legal risk, right, of some kid breaking their arm on school property, which then brings us to the idea of success and resentment. Did you guys have any?
Yeah, so it's a hard transition here. He's just gonna like jump over to Nietzsche really quick and lay out some literary references. And I think what he's doing throughout this chapter is he's kind of zooming in and out on how this kind of concept of coddling and overbearingness happens on the societal scale, it happens on the gender scale, it's going to happen sort of all over. And so he talks about Nietzsche, this concept of resentment. He's starting to make kind of calls to socialism here, and he's leading to the conclusion that if a system or if a person does something and you don't understand why it did that, look more at the consequences of the actions themselves. And so that's true societally, it's true of those skate blockers, that yes, they intended to, I don't know, keep the banister from being scuffed, to keep kids from getting hurt, but the impact of it or the effect of it is kids that are biting their nails and are frustrated and they can't skate, and just an uglier banister. And that people that actually are trying to help people are usually not motivated by changing other things or changing things. They take responsibility and they kind of bear it themselves. So he's covering a lot of ground in this section. And Roger, I'd love for you to come in here with more detail. But I think the idea here is that that coddling is not effective across the board.
The memory I'll add is that I am old enough to remember when there were motel swimming pools that had diving boards. Now you can see the 4 holes in the concrete where the bolts used to go in to hold the diving board. But thanks to our lawyers, you'll never have a diving board in the motel swimming pool.
Yeah, and he also kind of tries to, he starts by highlighting like that several, especially if you go to the depth psychologists, which is what Peterson kind of associates with, there's this constant theme of resentment, and especially resentment of the successful or resentment of the daring, right? Of constantly pulling down. And it goes back even to the Cain and Abel idea that when something competitive rises above you, you have 2 reactions. You can either aspire to want to be like the thing that you see as higher than you, or you can resent it for being higher than you and try to pull it down. And he points to Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment, or like resentment, essentially, of people that wish to make everything equal, not because of some sense of actual fairness, but rather some sense of resentment of their incapacity to do it itself. He also points to Freud's idea of dreams as being this expression of ideas that you have that don't have that the ego or the conscious self won't totally accept. So there's this kind of hidden point. And then he also points to Jung's idea of the shadow, and what he's trying to get at is that all of these different concepts seem to point to the same thing of you having unknown resentment to you, and you not being aware of that resentment that you hold towards someone who you see as a threat. It's kind of the same effect to when you have someone that's intimidating, or someone that you hate and you don't have a good reason to hate, but you hate it, you want to hate them anyway, right? Like everyone's kind of had that where they're actually a really nice person, which makes you not like them even more. It's like you just feel threatened by them. And he even points this out to that Orwell also noted something similar, and he noted it with the socialists, because Orwell used to be a socialist. Well, and he was a socialist, but like he critiqued some of the further left, as far as my understanding. And he writes The Road to Wigan Pier, which Peterson kind of dives a little bit into, and talks. It's a novel written in 1937 about the miners in the UK, and it's about their struggles as, the working class. A lot of times having to walk up to 3 miles into the ground, into a small tunnel, hunched, just to start to work, and then 3 miles back, which Orwell basically says is like climbing a mountain to and from work. And what Orwell concludes when, as to why socialism doesn't seem to be taking up be taken up in the UK, even though so many people are struggling so hard. And he concludes that a lot of the middle and upper class socialists seem to not really care so much about the poor as much as they hold the resentment for the rich. And that seems to be a stronger motivation for their ideology, or at least for a lot of them. And that there's a hidden, similar to Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung, that there's this hidden resentment behind that of a form of success that they can't seem to achieve, but that they see as someone who has achieved not quite earning it correctly, or not earning it within their moral sphere. And this is where kind of Jung pulls that tool of, and this is a tool that of course is not 100%, it's just more of like a last resort, a way to understand people is, if you cannot understand why someone did something, look at the consequences and infer the outcome. And the idea is, when you do that, a lot of times you may find that something that naturally you might think would not be something that's desired may actually be what they were aiming for. So you may see this with people that prefer to be victimized, right? And because normally, as we almost always assume, it's like, well, if you're a victim of any form of trauma or any form of situation, or if it's something that's beyond your control, then naturally you must hate that and must not want to be there. And to some extent that is true, but there's always the flip side also. It also removes all responsibility and liability from your end, and you're seen as a martyr, or you're seen as a victim. You're seen with empathy and with sympathy. It's like, and you shouldn't completely devalue just how much and how powerful that could be itself as a psychological motivating factor, if that makes sense.
This is one part I very much disagreed with in that we don't really care for the poor, we just hate the rich. And I think he also made the point that there's really nothing you can do about it anyway. But to me, you have to think back 100 years ago, we were just coming out of the Gilded Age, very similar to today, that there were some ultra rich and the typical worker was very poor. And we created the graduate income tax. We did transfer from the rich to the poor. Now, since then, it's been gone the other way again. But to me, that's a problem we can solve without hating the rich.
Oh yeah, and yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That like it doesn't necessitate that. I think Peterson, just because he mentions Cambodia later on, I think that's more the kind of resentment that he's actually talking about. Where in Cambodia, it was kind of just this horror show where they would kill the top tier of the richest people, and then kill the next tier, and then kill the next tier, and like it was just consecutively resentment of blaming everyone that was above them, right?
Yeah, I think it was the Cultural Revolution in China that 30, 40 years ago was very similar. Kill all the elites, or send them out to the work in the fields or whatever. Yeah.
And so for Peterson to explore this resentment a little bit more, he brings another anecdote from his own life, with a section called More About Chris. And for those that have been following us through this entire book, Chris was the nihilist friend from his childhood that would drive around the beat up truck from Rule 3. And he points out that Peterson and Chris had both grown up going to school with a lot of Native American children in Fairview, Canada. And he tells this quick story about his friend Renee, and how one time he gets in an altercation with him and almost gets beat up. And then he kind of mentions how he was always trying to kind of work with them as equals. And he noted that Chris, however, had much more self-hatred and never really stood his ground. And from his perspective, he saw himself as, well, look, man, we took their land. Like, no wonder they're mad at us. We deserve whatever they give us. And he said that later that self-hatred and self-aimed hatred started to get blamed to not just himself, but then masculinity as a whole, where he saw that everything that had to do with masculinity was often led to the issues of the world. So it was like us, the world being conquered by certain countries was all masculine in nature. The world being kind of polluted and pillaged and torn apart was always masculine. War was always, so Peterson kind of notes that there's this constant pattern of him really starting to hate any associations with the masculine, and kind of diving into this idea. He points out that Chris finds Buddhism quite appealing because it actually, one of the principles that he takes from it is the negation of the self, right? The negation of the ego, and kind of not fully engaging in all the natural things that you might associate with masculinity or femininity, with the ego as a whole. Did you guys have any ideas?
Yeah, and he goes on to, you know, this resentment that comes from Chris kind of hating his masculinity. Peterson says he started out hating men and he ended up hating women. And so he's going to use sort of Chris's life throughout this story. He used it, as he said in chapter 3, to start to paint this picture of the resentful person. He tells a story of Chris living with him and his wife Tammy, and him being responsible for cooking a dinner once a week, just sort of pulling his slack in the family, and how much he resented doing that he kind of went to go fix something in the pipes to kind of act manly, to avoid, to burn the dinner, to kind of ruin it on purpose, and Tammy not letting him do that. But just his own sort of being being rejected by women led him to be resentful toward him, and suddenly he's hating both sides of him.
Yeah, to me, he was making the point that a woman can compete with men. Say, if she can play football if she wants to, or especially women's basketball is very competitive. But a man competing in a woman's sport or with women, it says, yeah, there's no way that will ever work or whatever. So it's really bringing out the differences in the gender roles. And although I don't know, that was,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he's going to bring that point back a few times.
yeah.
Yeah, and just to tie up the Chris's story, if he kind of keeps seeing Chris slowly become more and more antagonistic, first towards masculinity, and then towards femininity, and then towards the end, just towards people in general. And it's kind of spread, and it goes back to that same type of resentment that he points to even in 3, where this idea that the resentment can spread to the point where it becomes anti-human, to the point where you become the self, as the next section is called, the self-appointed judge of humanity. And he notes that eventually right before his 40th birthday, Chris's 40th birthday, he gets a call from Chris saying that he actually got a job because he had been unemployed for a while, and then that he was actually going to get some stories published. And like Peterson's like, oh, this is great, this is good. And the next day they find Chris dead from suicide. He drives his beat up truck and puts a hose from the muffler to the cab. And Peterson kind of just remembers, calling his father, and, the father saying, "My beautiful baby boy." And then Peterson points out this time when he gave a TED Talk, which you can also find on YouTube, and how right before he went up to go give this TED Talk, this other professor comes up and talks about all the different dangers and destructive aspects of humanity that have brought upon essentially the global warming and the destruction of the ecosystem as a whole. And the professor closes by saying that if you want to consider yourself ethical, you should consider only having one children or none. And Peterson notes again that both Chris's philosophy and that professor's philosophy is a direct judgment on humans as a flawed virus, which then brings us to his next point, which is anti-humanism, and this idea of hating humans as a species, of seeing us as something bad. And he kind of points out that we should really cut ourselves some slack for this chapter. And Claire, did you want to? I saw a smile.
No, you told that Chris story beautifully. I mean, it's a heartbreaking chapter. He spends a lot of pages on it. Chris he's murderous, he's depressed, and he goes through it all, and he really takes us along on that journey. But I think you told it beautifully. And what he's trying to set up, as you said, is this concept that You know, this sort of narrative that I think we all hear all the time, which is that, man, this is all going in a really dark place for so many different reasons. And why would you want to bring children into this earth, you know, for environmental reasons and all others? And he's going to start to make a case for the opposite. First, for sort of the environmental factor that we often hear with this kind of anti-humanism. He makes this case that, you know, environmentalism has really only been around since Silent Spring, about 50 years, that in the 1800s, they were saying it is literally impossible to exhaust the oceans. Plastics are only 50 years old. We've only really started to, and just this idea that time is really fast, right? And that we think that we've had these problems forever, but we've really only had running water and food and electricity for a while. Most families have someone that's sick, you know, and life is just awful and they're suffering, and he could talk about this ad nauseum. And yet humans have achieved such heights. The planet is really hard on us, and we have survived through it. We have unbelievable things like presumption of innocence, like the rule of law, like plumbing. Mortality rates are down. Like he talks about this forever. And I mean, I guess I'll stop on that point for a moment. Anything further?
Yeah, and he kind of like, he has that point where he's like, only a few decades ago we were starving, diseased, and illiterate, right? This idea of like, we should really give ourselves a little bit more credit, and the fact that like these new problems have come up are kind of just, it's like are factors of us resolving other older problems, right? Like the fact that that climate change is now a big issue is only because we've become so industrialized and globalized and have all these technology and machines that cause this new problem. And he also points out to just how amazing humans are as creatures, that we don't seem to have any real limits, and we seem to be pushing limits constantly in almost every factor. And he points to parkour, to gymnastics in the Olympics, to crane climbers, to skateboarders. It's like they're all testaments of that. You can compare, you know, what the most amazing thing was, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and compare it to what's done now, and they're completely different machines. There's one where he talks about watching a YouTube video where it's the 1960s gymnast versus the 2012 gymnast. And he's just like, yeah, the 1960s is like a very athletic gym teacher that does the vault, right? It's like, and then the 2012 is like some mechanical kangaroo that's flying through the air doing 3 flips and then lands perfectly, right? It's like this progression is, you know, unheard of, and there doesn't seem to be quite a limit to that, or at least we haven't hit it yet. And he points out that to see people as a virus, or to see people as this irredeemable plague, is to put yourself in the exact same mindset of the Columbine shooters, right? Of this idea that within that internal logic of that resentment, if we are a plague, then the destroyer of the plague is a hero. It's a good thing to destroy whatever is a plague, whatever is a risk to, you know, whatever you decide to put as the valuable thing in your story. And he points out that at no point would anyone support for any specific group to die, right? No one would ever say it's like all Jews, all Muslims, all Mexicans, all anything. We would never support someone saying that they all should die. It's like, and yet we seem to find it quite acceptable, or at least don't push back nearly as much if someone suggests that we should all die, right? We seem to find that more palatable, right? And like he kind of points out to like, well, why is that? And he kind of points that that's a very anti-human philosophy, and he points out that this seems to be permeating especially in the university. And he says that this like, in his eyes, this seems to be harming boys a lot, even though for, you know, and for the very reasons why it's hard to even say that nowadays, because he points out that young men are often being hit because, well, their accomplishments within the current common narrative are unearned. Their adherence to rape culture and therefore thus sexually suspect. Their ambitions make them plunderers of the planet. They're falling behind educationally. And he points out that women are increasing more and more in the colleges to the point where 50% they make up more than 50% of 2/3 of all majors. And he also points out that on top of that, men and boys in general tend to have a slight different temperament and personality profile. Boys tend to be more disobedient. They're less agreeable. They're less susceptible to anxiety and depression. Their interest tilts more towards things rather than people for women. And he also points out to the Scandinavian studies, which were the studies of as gender differences, that the study that found, or several studies that found that gender differences increase as gender barriers or gender discrimination decreased, which was the exact opposite of what most people thought we would find. You would expect that the more barriers you get rid of that would be sexist in one way or another, the more equally distributed that would be. And Peterson kind of points out, it's like, well, it makes sense if you think about it. If you take the proposition that in general, men tend to be more interested in things and women tend to be more interested in people, which correlates with agreeableness versus disagreeableness, then naturally women would go for the fields that have a higher interest in people, that affect people more directly, and men would go more directly into things that have more to do with things. And he kind of points to what Dave had talked about earlier, this idea of another problem is that boys' games and girls' games and the social hierarchies they play within aren't exactly equal. So a girl can play a boy's game, right? And if she wins in that game, it's a win for her. But a boy can't always win in a girl's game. And he points out, for example, imagine 2 9-year-olds, and it's a boy and a girl that engage in an actual physical fight. From the girl's perspective, from the girl's end, it's kind of a win-win to some extent socially. And for the boy, it's a lose-lose to some extent socially, because if he wins, it's like, it's just a horrible guy that just beat up a girl. And if he loses, it has a similar consequence on both ends. And what he points out is it costs him socially and as far as attraction to other mates. So like, I thought this whole point of different hierarchies and how they combine was actually quite interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Because I know Dave, you probably disagree, I'm assuming.
No, I completely agree that, yeah, it's very skewed this direction. Yeah, and I think the other thing I mentioned to you earlier, this thing about that, it's not a patriarchy because a man invented the tampon, which, I'm waiting for Claire to set loose on that. But, after having 45 male presidents and almost every CEO of every respected company is a man, we have a few women around to marry somebody that's in charge of GM. And Melinda Gates, I think, has done a good job of maybe steering Bill Gates Jr. into philanthropy. But to me, in the real world of whatever, it's still very much patriarchy and male dominated.
Yeah, so Peterson's going to move this next section. He's going to talk about this and he's going to start to get into kind of career and marriage and why this situation might not be a good idea for women also. So as Roger kind of painted, men only have one set of games they get to play in. Women get to play in both. And if you take away men's ability to play games that are potentially naturally more aggressive, if we kind of soften their ability to skateboard and push up against that and be aggressive and potentially make others uncomfortable and lean into that kind of natural biological tendency. If they aren't able to do that, what can they else can they turn to? Where can they go with that kind of frustration? And Peterson says, you know, this kind of moving away from universities and men just, you know, not wanting to engage in the kind of games that men play either is really bad news for men, and it's really bad news for women also. And that's, he's gonna take that into a story of an argument for women and men. He's going to take a different perspective than I think Dave is laying out here. His classic example here is female lawyers. That, you know, in his own practice, and there's one study that he always refers to, when you take, you know, he take a group of highly educated, high in conscientiousness, high achiever women who Ivy League, move on to go to, you know, law school, get it placed in the best, you know, firm, they move up, they, you know, eventually place as partner, they get to 35, and really in droves, they drop off. They, you know, even though they have it all, they have what they pursued, they're getting, you know, the reaps of their labor, they want something more. I should probably actually use the numbers and not just totally generalize this. But it's a lot is the kind of basic idea here. And that, you know, it's a quick chapter, and he's just starting to make a statement that, you know, women want in life a partner of higher or equal status. Men are totally okay to marry down, and generally, you know, because of that natural biological proclivity, there's certain interests that are different. I'm not saying this well, but help me here.
No, you're okay. And yeah, because essentially what Peterson kind of points out is that once men or boys start to drop out of school or start to not play into those games, and women really start to succeed in those games, you start to see this interesting dynamic of high demand for really highly skilled, capable men, and very low supply. And as Claire pointed out, a lot of times highly successful women often struggle to find men that can keep up. And they more and more have to kind of settle for hookups, or kind of settle for not nearly as secure relationships. And he points out that studies have shown that both sexes desire long-term relationships that are safe and loving. However, women tend to often be that tends to be one of the higher priorities, as like what is most wanted, whereas men might not list that as much. And he quotes some studies. One is from 1997 to 2012. Women aged 18 to 34 who said that marriage was the most important thing, rose from 28% to 37%. However, for men, it actually dropped from 35% to 29%. And then once you get past 30, the numbers get really interesting, because from age 30 to 59, men are 3 times more likely to say they never want to get married. So you can see this kind of dropping off of long-term relationships. And Peterson also kind of questions this idea of that career is the most important or valuable thing in life. And he kind of asks, like, well, who would make that value association, right? Who would presume that what you do just to make money is more valuable than family and having a loving relationship? And he kind of points out that one of the main reasons why those peak hierarchies exist is because there's a very small subset of men that are extremely disagreeable and extremely competitive and extremely conscientious that have to win at everything. You know, every now, like I think most of us probably met at least one of them, where no matter what, they have to win at everything. And those are the people that will often climb to the top. And what Peterson the case that Peterson seems to be making is like, well, why would anyone presume that that's actually a desirable thing? Why would you presume that that's actually something worth chasing, unless that's exactly the personality type you are? And he also kind of points out that that high-performing females tend to prefer high-performing males. And this is where we get into the idea of hypergamy, that tendency for women to date across and up their social hierarchy. So if women are going up and men are going down, there's just not enough men that can actually account for this. And what he points out is women, why do women want someone who's higher than them in some sense? It's like, well, because of the natural situation that women are the ones that normally have to carry a child if they're going to have a kid. And being as one of the main reasons for a relationship is, like biologically speaking, is to create another child. The selection process for that is to find someone who can at least provide something. And the idea is, well, if someone's lower than you have a liability at that point. You don't have someone who's actually providing something. You have someone who's going to be even bigger burden on you. If you're the breadwinner, if you're the person that's providing most of the things, and this useless man isn't providing much of anything, what's the benefit to him being here in the first place? So the idea of attractive level, from Peterson's perspective, that is kind of one of the reasons why it's also not good for women, because as you see, there's a bigger increase in that. And then on top of that, it's not good for the children either, right? There's plenty of stats that he quotes about fatherless children, but the biggest one he points is that fatherless children are 4 times more likely to be poor, which also means the mother, can end up being poor. And he kind of points out this general premise, and then from here it starts to jump into the ideological, which says that this natural phenomenon that we're seeing within our own culture is getting even more complicated with the new ideologies that are starting to rise out of the colleges. You guys have anything else about that?
You did such a good job with that. That was fantastic.
All right.
Should we move on to the patriarchy?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, it's just a little topic.
And yeah, so for Peterson's conceptualization of the patriarchy, he takes it on. I'm going to set up a little bit of background here. For Peterson's perspective, there's 3 main ways we categorize the world: the mother, the father, and the hero, or the self. And for example, the patriarchy, Peterson sees it as half a version of the father or the benevolent king / tyrannical king. And as he points out, it's like, look, culture is always oppressive. It's like, it's by its nature, that's what it is. Culture grabs you and takes away your individuality and forces you to be a certain kind of way. And he says, like, and there's a lot of sacrifice and there's a lot of potential lost when that happens. At the same time, the trade-off for that is that it allows you to function within a society, right? It allows you to actually act with other people in a certain way that allows us all to agree and be in a society where we can all anticipate each other's moves and each other's attitudes and beliefs. And what he points out is that this idea of the tyrannical king is what many modern day feminists from his perspective would call the patriarchy, right? The oppressive, male dominated hierarchy that constantly is trying to maintain power. And Peterson tries to make the case about hierarchies that says, look, there's several facts about hierarchies that are just kind of rough, but the realities. Any hierarchy will always produce winners and losers. Some people are going to be good at it. Some people are not, no matter what's at the top of the hierarchy. A collective pursuit for a goal will always produce a hierarchy. No matter what is valued, some people are going to be better at it than others, and therefore the hierarchy is going to naturally form. And the third and final one is the pursuit of goals is part of the way that we create meaning in life. So it's a necessity to create hierarchies. And then from here, he kind of also challenges the view from a critical perspective of seeing history as men versus women, as opposed to men and women versus nature. And he points to there's multiple interpretations that you could take on history. One is men have always oppressed women and have constantly controlled their sexuality and have constantly attempted to oppress them. He offers an alternative view that is, no, look, men and women have tried their best to work together to survive and be almost a teammate with split roles and split responsibilities that they've tried to navigate as best they can. And it's not until now that we've risen to a point where the birth control, where menstruation, where a lot of the natural hindrances of women can be controlled for, or at least made more manageable, to the point where now that's no longer an issue. So that's why all these new questions are coming up about what a woman is compared to a man, where it used to be like, well, the difference between men and women is that a woman can get pregnant, and more importantly, before birth control, there wasn't much control over that. It's like, but now that all these new technologies come, we're reevaluating those roles, we're reevaluating all these things. And it's like, that's kind of the general cultural process we're currently in for Peterson. And he's not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. He's just saying, like, that's just a thing. That's just what is happening. But yeah, I'll stop there and see if you guys have anything.
I really like this point. And, you know, his idea, as you're saying, it's not necessarily a good thing, but we at least need to take these things into account before we just assume that men tyrannize women forever. And I think if we lay out the history of disease and war and famine, and then you put, childbirth on top of it, and the birth control pill has only been around 50 years. I think that's a really pivotal thing that Peterson thinks we just haven't grappled with or even begun to understand the implications on us. The example that I like to pull in here when talking about kind of patriarchy and Peterson is the Linda Nochlin artist example, which I used in a talk a while ago. So Linda Nochlin has this famous piece, "Why have there been no great female artists?" So like, why is there only Picasso and Da Vinci? Like, why are those the greats? And okay, one alternative is that it's just oppressive. The definition of greatness is set by men to keep women out of it, and it was set up to make us fail, and it's a bloated system, and we need to redo it. Or is the alternative that women weren't getting educated, they were mostly in childbearing roles, they weren't mostly being able to read, they weren't, because of kind of moral things, allowed to see a naked body or draw other people. Like, what does that implication have really on the outcomes? And so whether it doesn't make it good or bad, it certainly isn't ideal. I have Frida Kahlo right here, that we don't talk about great female artists. It's not great, but it's not because of an intentional thing that the people at the top said, let's keep women out. It was just the impact of the circumstances. So the tampon example, I think, Dave, I think the idea is, if women could have been sitting around with money and access to solve their problems, they probably would have commercialized a product like that thousands of years ago. But men were the ones doing that, and therefore they're the ones that came up with it.
Yeah, it's amazing how much our society has changed in the last few generations. Because women were just the housekeepers, but now especially with World War II, they started having jobs and found out they could support themselves. So that was the rise of divorce, that they didn't have to depend on the man, and been some unfortunate circumstances with that.
Yeah, Peterson, in the Maps Meaning lecture that I was covering for the other group, Peterson made a really good point where he says, you have to consider the fact that we were able to create a culture and a society in which the pill itself was even able to be invented. It's like, in which we didn't just burn the guy that invented the pill at the stake, right? Like, it's like that the entire culture was actually quite accepting of that. It's like, because he points out that the Catholic Church was not happy when that pill was invented, right? Because it completely recontextualized what sex and sexuality meant and was. So kind of keeping that within the context of like just how big of a technological change it is to be able to now control one of the most primary biological functions that we have as human beings, which is our reproduction, right? Like, that's never in the history's been ever happened. So like, kind of really considering, well, that happened super recently. How long would that take to actually play out? And, for us to understand what that actually means. And for Peterson, that's what we're going through right now. That's what we're living through. And, it's having all these other side effects. And from here, this is where Peterson starts to get a little bit more on the political end. And he points to these departments that seem to start living on their expressed goal is to undermine, the patriarchy or different conceptualizations of an oppressive system. And Peterson kind of makes the point. It's like, should we really be using public state funds to fund activism that is directly aiming at undermining the very thing that provided the funds, right? It's like there's nothing wrong with describing those ideas, but should this be part of the university? On that part, that's, I personally don't fully agree on his point, but I do understand what his point is, and I think there can be some merit to that. And from there, he kind of points to postmodernism and how postmodernism kind of comes from, it's kind of the root of critical theory, some versions of feminism, and kind of takes a backwards history of where postmodernism originally develops, starting with the Frankfurt School in Germany. And he points out that the Frankfurt School was originally set up after, the Marxist theory had kind of failed, and was an attempt to do a full-scale critique and transformation of Western civilization. He also points to the Khmer Rouge as a failed version of communism. For those that don't know, the Khmer Rouge is in Cambodia, was this extremist group, extreme communist group that essentially took over the Cambodian government in a civil war, and then led to a mass genocide towards the end that led to 1 out of 4, or 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4. The count is kind of iffy, as it always is with these kinds of situations, of people dying. And as I mentioned earlier, dying pretty much for no real reason. People were getting killed for having an education. People were being killed for having glasses. People were being killed. At one point, there was only one doctor in the entire country. Like, it had gotten really, really bad. And so he kind of points to that as like some of the failures of the communism that then led to the rise of postmodernism, which we can get into. I don't know if anyone had any points before I go in.
Yeah, he's going to use some of his favorite in the worst stories in human history. I mean, literally a quarter of the entire Cambodian population was killed in fields. It worked to death, like just the unfathomable. In the next section, he'll bring up the Gulag Archipelago, one of his favorite books, and the story of Solzhenitsyn, who was placed in the most unfathomable conditions in the gulags in Soviet Russia, and chose to instead of becoming resentful or killing himself or killing others, chose to write about it and to detail it so that it wouldn't happen again. And that, what better hero story than that?
Right. And because he starts with, because the next section, he kind of goes through how communism was originally played out. And he points out that, look, before World War I, it's not, you could be forgiven for thinking that communism would be a great idea, right? Like, there was a lot of appeal to it. It seemed to be, quite idealistic, but like within the times seemed to make sense. The alternatives seemed to be much worse. And a lot of times the communists would stand up for things that were quite reasonable. I think he points that the communists were supporting the Republicans in Spain, I think, and that places like the UK and the US hadn't quite supported that yet. And it was kind of for the intelligentsia, they saw it as like, our own government won't support this. That's obviously humanly right, but we have these communists that would. So there was a lot of good reasons to believe in the system. And then he kind of goes through, the general story that you see about, for example, like Stalin rounding up the kulaks, which were, Ukrainian farmers, shipping them to Serbia, and then having mass starvation, and a lot of general criticisms of the Soviet Union. And he then points to the Gulag Archipelago as one of the defining points where truth, and for Peterson, he truly sees this as an example of truth breaking free and kind of destroying a system of lies. And what he points that Solzhenitsyn had done was that it showed that the Soviet system could not survive without tyranny and slave labor. And he points out that after this happened, after a lot of these horrors started to come out, a lot of people had already developed an association with Marxism but it was no longer logically justified. And here, this is where Peterson gets some criticism, but I also think a lot of times it gets conflated with what he's saying, because what I think Peterson tends to be saying here, which is where he gets the term postmodern neo-Marxists, is that he's saying that the moral view of these people was still Marxist from this time, but then the rationale for their actions, or for how they acted, had much more to do with the postmodern view of this idea, where definitions start to get outside of it. And he brings in Deidre and points that Deidre's theory of categories, that categories naturally exclude and are created mostly to benefit a group, and to exclude and separate from another group. And so postmodernism is notoriously confusing and notoriously unclear. So I'm just going to read you his definition, but I do want to also emphasize that even Peterson's always also gotten criticism from his understanding of postmodernism, but it's, you can try and read it yourself. It is always a very interesting and complicated approach. But he points to Deidre's theory of categories and says, there are women only because men gain by excluding them. There are males and females only because members of the most heterogeneous group benefits by excluding a tiny minority of people whose biological sexuality is amorphous. Science only benefits the scientists. Politics only benefits the politicians. So this idea of creating categories only benefits either the person that's in the category or the people that are out of the category. So for example, like a category such as in the 90s, what was known as gay is an overbroad category that was meant just to exclude, or so it's this idea that it's more of a power game than anything else. And Deidre was famous for being quoted as saying, there is no outside text, or there's nothing outside the text. But both, the main point was, in postmodernism, is essentially this idea of there is no cohesive interpretation of the world. There's no cohesive grand narrative. And the idea is, if there is no outside text and everything is text, or everything can be made into text, then there isn't anything outside of our own system that can help us define our system. So every word we use, we only define it with other words, which means we only use, and every one of those words is only defined by other words, and every one of those words is only defined by other words. Like our meanings and definitions and interpretations are all within the self system, and there's nothing outside it that can help us define it. So it's all interpretation. And this is what Peterson takes it to ultimately have to mean. It's like anything can be interpreted in any way. And we just happen to be choosing to interpret things a certain way because of our cultural upbringing, because of our past, because of our personal preferences. And this is where you start to get these concepts of flexibility of identities and genders, and the specificity of all these things start to become much more flexible, because at the end of the day, from Peterson's perspective, it's all just interpretive in nature. You can change it however you'd like. Anything else before I go? I don't want to just keep going off.
Oh, you're killing it. What is that term that you use that's Peterson's? Is like postmodern neo-Marxist? Is that?
Yeah. So a lot of the Marxists tend to criticize that idea, because from their perspective, they would say, look, postmodern and neo-Marxist are two completely different perspectives, and they're actually contradictory, because a postmodernist says, well, there's no grand narrative understanding of the world, and a Marxist would say there's definitely a grand narrative understanding of the world. It's the, one is the class struggle, it's the story of capital, it's the people who actually have things. So putting them together, most people are like, well, that's a contradiction. And Peterson has said before, he's like, yeah, I know it's a contradiction. It's like, but the fact that they're using postmodern theory to pursue Marxist goals, right, means that they have a Marxist moral structure, and they use postmodern. It's almost like a weaponized postmodernism to get to those goals. Or at least that's my understanding, as far as I've gotten to actually make sense of that. That's what I've understood, but I could be wrong. So I'm by no means gonna die on that hill.
No, I think it's well said. And as he wraps this section, his sort of thesis here is that all outcomes cannot be equalized. He doesn't talk about the Pareto distribution, but that's this classic example of,
Mm.
you know, there's always going to be some winners and there's going to be a lot of losers, and that's just nature. And something, you know, a lot of ideas are contradictory, and aligning ourselves to ideas and to group identities is not accurate, because identity really can be fractioned down in different ways all the way to the level of the individual. And there's contradictions when you try to do these groupings. And in reality, really all people are unique.
Yeah, and I just looked at time and I'm like, oh, we still got a little bit to go. So I'm going to try to hurry this up a little bit. But yeah, so he kind of points to this idea of like these categories, yeah, like Claire said, never quite capture the full variety of the people. And it's anything you do is kind of always an overgeneralization of that group and the people within it. And then he kind of moves on to this other alternative that's been proposed of, well, what if we raise boys more like girls? Because girls seem to be more sociable, they seem to be nicer, they seem to be just in general function more pro-social, like better in groups, better with everything else. And they define it as developing tenderness, sensitivity to feelings, cooperative, aesthetic appreciation, and kind of trying to stay away from aggression, right? Not teach boys aggression, or that aggression is even okay. And Peterson points out, it's like, all right, well, first and foremost, aggression isn't taught, it's controlled. He points out, it's like, it's one of our most basic human states. It's kind of, along with the drive for sex and several other things, predatory and defensive aggression is a natural thing that we have. And he points out that, and especially a subset of boys, around 5%, are hyper aggressive, especially when they're really young. They do more biting, kicking, hitting than, you know, the rest of their peers. And what he points out is like, they don't unlearn it. It's not like they stop learning to be aggressive. They integrate it into more complex, socially acceptable and beneficial behavior that we normally would identify with determination. It's the source of energy that allows them to want to get something and want to win. It's that sense of competitiveness. It's that sense of wanting to dominate, which isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes, you know, like, if you want to dominate a challenge, that's not necessarily something that can be seen as bad. And he does point out that's like, look, not everyone integrates this. Sometimes those kids aren't fully socialized, and that then starts to develop into antisocial behavior. And they start to become outcasts. They start to have less friends. They start having harder time being friendly to others because of their overly aggressive nature. But he points out that, but even then, you can't just brush that off as, you know, their aggression being worthless. Like, at its bare necessity, it's at least useful for self-protection. And then he flips it to the other side. He's like, now let's look at what's being prescribed here. And this section of compassion as a vice. And he points out what the problem with being too nice, with being overly agreeable. He says, you see the world as 50-50, like someone who is overly agreeable or overly compassionate. And what that means is, if I'm working with someone else, I'll give half, you give half. And he says, the problem is you think others think like you. So you won't stand up for yourself when there is a conflict, and you presume that they're gonna give back just as much as you're giving. And if that's not the case, you start to become resentful because they're not reciprocating your attitude. But in reality, someone who's very disagreeable is not using that strategy at all. I can say that, like, I'll say that myself with my girlfriend. That's one of the hardest things between us is from her perspective, she's like, we're a team. I'll work with you. I'll give you 50, you give me 50. And from my perspective, a lot of times my default is, I'm going to get as much as I can. You're going to get as much as you can, and we'll negotiate in the middle. Right? And it's two completely different strategies. Both are viable, but it requires that the other side actually knows what's happening. So me and her having to kind of navigate that. And I think for a lot of men and women, that's a constant struggle where, you know, the girl's like, we're a team, we're doing this together. And on average, the girl and the guy, it's a 60-40 split. So it's not always either side, but there's that constant dynamic that can play out. And he also points out that this is also the same traits of agreeable, compassionate, empathetic, conflict adverse people tend to let others walk all over them. It makes them compliant. They're not normally willing to fully stand up, or they struggle with that. And he points out that this is also what can lead to what Freud called the edible mother complex. And it's the idea of, or the devouring mother also, as is known. And it's the idea of being overbearing and coddling for your children because you want to have them there. You want to kind of hold on to them. So Peterson finally gets to his final takeaway point, and he points to the last section called "Toughen Up, You Weasel," naturally. And he makes the point about the utility of bullies and the idea that a bully essentially functions within the ecosystem of their class as someone who is, in a way, toughening up everyone else. Now, that doesn't necessitate it can't go too far. It doesn't necessitate it's a good thing, but it necessitates that that is the reaction to a small version of the world, a small version of the adversity that you might face, right? He's a representative of the things that you'll likely face outside of the world. And what he points out that if we keep pushing men to not be dominant, to not show aggression, to not do this, and this is something that I think is quite important because I think a lot of people on the left don't seem to fully understand what part they have in pushing the rise of the especially extreme right. Peterson makes the case that if you keep pushing this, then there's a subconscious appeal to power, to dominance. And he makes the point of, for example, one of the reasons why Fight Club is such an appealing movie for so many people, especially nowadays. Why, for example, the term snowflake, which is from that movie and that book, has become ubiquitous within especially the right. And he says, like, that's one of the most pro-fascist movies that's come out of Hollywood. And he points out it's also the right why, you have a lot of support for Donald Trump, this random strong man that, or at least that he presents himself as this strong man that, won't take no buck from no one and will, do what he wants. And he says, and it's also like why you see this huge rise in the right in Europe. And what he kind of tries to make the point is like men are always testing themselves and pushing themselves when they engage in dangerous things, because things will inevitably become dangerous. When a teenager's doing donuts in the parking lot, they're testing the limits of themselves and their cars. They're attempting to exert control in a situation that's out of control. When they tell their teacher off, they're pushing and testing authority to see if there is any real authority there. And just for clarification, Peterson sees authority as the thing that you submit to voluntarily. And finally, he says, look, healthy women want a partner that brings something that they can't provide. And he points to some research that says higher income, higher education, higher confidence, higher intelligence, dominance, or social position. To stomp out that spirit of children or people trying to embody that is anti-human in Peterson's view. And he says, and if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. Leave children alone when they are skateboarding. Anything else you guys want to add before we go?
Very well done.
Perfect ending.
All right.
Mr. Kant, are you back? Okay, he messaged me he was going to step away for a moment. So that wraps up our dialogue portion. We will move on now to questions and answers. So if you have a question, throw it in the chat with an exclamation point, or if you have a comment. There's not really. Lots of comments here. Wow.
Yeah, I was just saying, I could see the number popping up, but I'm like, oh yeah, we gotta get through this.
I was trying to listen to Roger, and I didn't have time to read all the chat. But I do want to thank, and even last week too, several people gave me some brownie points in chat. It was very kind of you. But too bad we aren't able to go back and read the chat later. But,
all right, let's. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and put a exclamation point. If not, all right, cool. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hey guys, wonderful presentation as always. Really phenomenal work. So I guess when I'm thinking about this chapter, there's a lot to unravel here. And it also connects with another book called The Boy Crisis, which was written actually by a former feminist, and he actually echoes all of the same statistics as Peterson. Women are attending college in a 60-40 ratio roughly, and so forth. And, you know, I think a lot about why this is happening, right? Like, why are we telling men you need to be softer, you need to be more woman-alike, you have to be more agreeable? And it's like, I think to myself, like, typically men have always had like higher wages and so forth because they fought for it. Like, there were unions, they went on strike. Like, throughout American history, you see these very, very violent union strikes. And a thought that occurs to me almost is if, like, if we can kind of like train men to be more agreeable or softer, or kind of just shove them out of the workforce altogether, then that kind of like opens up the door for like big companies and so forth to pay people less, or have employees that are a lot more meek and meager. So I don't know, like, it may have like come out of third wave feminism initially, like, yay, you know, strong woman, and like channeling your inner woman. But I kind of see some very like nefarious stuff going on here with this. I think that like there is this issue of kind of really just making people docile and kind of like extinguishing the fire almost, if you would, of like what people deserve.
I think a couple generations back, there were manufacturing jobs for people as men with a high school education,
Yeah.
and they paid well enough that they could support their family. And the wife didn't have to go to work. She could stay home and take care of the kids. And to me, that was the huge change, because all the good jobs either went to other countries or they were replaced by robots and technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's several things we couldn't get to just out of time, but one of them that I think was very interesting was just this idea that marriage, which is normally seen as this patriarchal construct that's, you know, made to control sexuality and humanity, has now become, or is becoming, something that mostly only privileged rich people do. Right. That more and more, it's an indicator of your social economic status more than anything else. So if only the rich are getting married, right? It's like, Peterson kind of comments, it's like, is that an indication that only the rich are willing to be subjugated to this, you know, old tradition that is kind of outdated and useless, right? I also want to make a very clear distinction between a very small group of people that have very extreme ideas, and more the general mainstream. I think Peterson kind of doesn't do a good job in distinguishing between the two, right? Because like it's easy to paint with a broad brush, but I think most people that identify with feminism or with almost any of the ideas that he often criticizes, that if you ask most of those people, they likely don't believe. Well, I mean, honestly, most people from all sides don't tend to read theory very well or know where the ideas that they believe and even come from. So it's kind of hard to like hold that against them or hold anything like that. And also, not everyone believes those kind of beliefs. So kind of just making a distinction that the group that we're talking about tends to be the small radical extreme, not most of the point, not general. Most people don't believe these things, right? So just his point is that putting that into young people can be very destructive, especially because those young people eventually become everyone, right?
Right.
Okay,
And
Abraham, next question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as always, it was great. I'd like to say, comment on some phenomenon, I would say modern phenomena, regarding the court system, yeah, and when it comes to custody issue. So it's a broader topic than you think, because if some of you went through that or have family member, this is much deeper than you think. It's like almost like a rabbit hole, but it shows something how the ruling class or government see family or male, I mean, certain direction. So late 1970s, it started from California. America, for example, adopted, I mean, almost, yeah, no fault system. What it means is I give you some graphic idea. Let's say I go home and my wife is having sex with, let's say, some plumber. And then I'm shocked because we have a few children. So I'm angry. And then she wants to get divorced. And then want to have sole custody, alimony, and almost, yeah, reputation, everything. But the judge doesn't care whether she had an affair at all. It's no fault system, no fault. That's what it means. It's no fault. So it's unprecedented in humanity. Some women know that, many women know that, how it works. And also what happened is court reward predominantly so far women when it comes to, if you have children. So many people committed suicide, or they spend 20 years paying certain things, let's say. So what I'm saying is not only that, let's say you go to the street and you have drink and you met someone, let's say. And then the woman got pregnant, let's say. But she's not sure whether it was you or the one or a few others she met. No offense to women, let's say here. She met a few weeks ago, let's say. So when she gives birth, she doesn't have the husband or father of a baby. So there's a section that she can write down the name, biological father. It depends on the state, it depends on the country. But in France, the same, and many states, as far as I know, there is grace period. As a man, you can prove that this baby is not yours. If you miss that time slot, it's usually a year or 2 years, basically you are screwed. You cannot ask the court to verify this child is yours or not. The court doesn't allow that. The reason is the court doesn't want the government to be responsible for raising these children. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So what's happening is
Abraham, and
this random guy, Dave, is working, and then he received a notice from the court that you didn't pay child support for 3 years. If you don't pay in 2 months, I will take away your driver's license. I'll put you in jail. You'll become criminal. So Dave said, let's say, oh, I don't remember. And here's your name. So what I'm saying is, I'll end here. So many males don't know what's going on. Many males, some people say, are perishable in this, unless you are top 5% or 10% alpha male. You are hot and Friday night, and you have many children, but most male, they don't know what they are doing. And that's what some people say. I'm giving you some graphic idea. I mean, it's quite blunt. Anyway.
Well, I think that just comes from, like we were talking about, that complete shift in expectations, gender roles, because the system seems to be set up for what would be the norm in the 1950s, right? Which would be with like all the culture that came with all that, but the rules haven't seemed to be updated to modern day standards or culture. At least from my perspective, I would assume that that's one of the main things, is that the rules are still set up for a culture that's no longer existent. Claire, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And I think in some ways it's tried to be set up to protect the children, not the man or not the woman, but try to make sure the children have a good upbringing I know sometimes it's given, most times the possession is given to the woman, but visitation to the men most of the time. I was a mediator for a number of years, and it's, of course, that's a full-time business and so many divorces. But yeah, it's a difficult question.
Next one, G phone 2.
Jean?
Is that Jean?
Yeah.
Hi,
I
Jean.
think.
Jean,
G phone 2?
you're muted. All right, we'll come back to you, Joseph, how's it going?
Hey guys. Thanks for the presentation this evening. Again, I had to step away for a minute, so I'm a little bit behind on where everything is. I have two quick questions. The first one is the idea of the rich, despising the rich and not really liking the poor. Is, he's saying that there's really no such thing as true altruism. I mean, I may be misinterpreting that. I haven't really read this chapter, so I'm sorry for being a little behind on that. The idea, well, anyway, just go ahead and answer that. I have another question if you guys have a minute.
Yeah, no, but like by no means is he saying that like that's the case for everyone, right? And I think he's even said that a lot of times, because Peterson himself was also part of the Socialist Party for a while when he was younger. And he pointed out that when he was in it, what he noticed was that the people kind of on the ground, the people, going to protest, going to the pamphlet handling and all that, is like they actually seem to be quite genuinely part of the, like what most people claim, he said, but like a lot of the others, a lot of the people that seemed, or I might be having it flipped up, but he said that there was always a mix between the two. And one of the criticisms being that even if you bring about the, socialist revolution that you imagined in the most ideal sense, what makes you think that there isn't somebody who doesn't quite have that same goal in mind that's willing to go to an extreme that you might not be, right? And then just takes over and takes power, or situations like, for example, how, from my understanding, how Stalin came to power, right? By kind of taking out everyone else who was a threat to his own legitimacy. But kind of pointing out that like even if you yourself believe that your intentions are fully true, there's still obviously the possibility that not everyone around you has the exact same intentions. So simply because someone espouses these high and genuine values, that doesn't necessitate that everyone shares them and everyone believes in them. Yeah, and there may be a hidden motivation behind that.
In my reading the book, to me, it was an assertion, because I don't think it was really backed up by facts or even examples, but because it's not what I believe at all. But
Aaron, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond something to what Abraham said. Like in the book, in the boy crisis, it does say that like in some of these like divorce hearings, like the outcome is sometimes unfavorable to the men. I think though that it's also like a cultural thing, like in the boy crisis, and maybe Peterson also has alluded to this elsewhere, is that you have in the 90s and 2000s the emergence of the bumbling dad figure. And you see this in all of like the sitcoms, and you see this on TV, where the father is completely incompetent, he can't do anything, he doesn't know anything. And then you also have in the 90s and 2000s like this, all of these like Lifetime movies that that kind of have like a woman trying to protect her kids, and her like abusive like husband is trying to get them, and like we have this kind of culture that for at least 20 years kind of like destabilized and sort of like demonized the father figure, like, and made them all kind of like Jack Nicholson from The Shining in a way. And I think that's had like a very lasting impact that we have when we view fathers. Like, I work in the school system, And I always hear like the school psychologist or the social work being like, of course the father's not available, or don't even bother calling the dad's number. He's not going to pick up. Or, you know, it's just like this presumption that the father is totally not with it. He can't be relied on. And I think when society has that very, very low bar of men, then they kind of act the part, so to speak.
Yeah, I would say you run into the chicken or the egg scenario, right? Because at the same time you've seen, and Peterson also points to this idea of like more and more globalization leads to less and less manufacturing job, which leads to more and more people of the working class not being able to be the breadwinners of the house, not being able to be the person that's providing. So which one causes which, you know, who knows? It may just be that artistic representation could also just be a reflection of the actual changes within the culture itself that were being just reflected into modern days.
Folks, sorry to interrupt. Do you guys want to start the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I think that was the last question.